Cast your mind back to the dark days of the pandemic when we were all stuck at home, unable to get to work, see other people in person, talking to each other on Zoom all the time. I think that those dark days presented us with some real institutional design challenges for the science policy interface. I think that the nice thing about this workshop is that I think we're all focused on trying to articulate those challenges and design solutions to them. I mean, here is an attempt to crystallize what I think the basic challenge is. Now, I think in emergencies like COVID-19, we often find scientific disagreement. The scientific disagreement has major policy implications. Somehow that storm of disagreement has to be resolved into a decision. The politicians lack the expertise to adjudicate among the different scientific camps, and moreover, they're incentivized to cherry pick opinions that are favorable to their values and priorities. And yet the alternative to politicians adjudicating these disputes seems to be to outsource dispute resolution to scientific advisors in a way that creates a risk of groupthink and a lack of accountability. The design challenge is, can we somehow design a science policy interface that would guard against these things, that would guard against groupthink and cherry picking, while avoiding accountability gaps and expertise gaps? In this talk, I will try to exemplify those problems with some examples from the pandemic, and then offer some thoughts on solutions, which are of course quite tentative because I think no one really has the solution, but we can talk about possible things that might help. So problems, I've written about the UK's initial response to COVID-19 in early 2020 in this very substantial paper called Science and Policy in Extremis from the European Journal for Philosophy of Science. I'm not going to summarize that whole paper, but it sort of analyzes the case, makes various different recommendations. The initial response was undoubtedly an absolute tragedy. One of the really surreal things about it, looking back, was the way that you had SAGE and the UK government's scientific advisors recommending a strategy that was fundamentally mistaken, at least initially. And then you had these marginal voices calling for the strategy that was eventually adopted for immediate aggressive suppression of transmission. And they, I think, were substantially correct. So some very, very marginal voices like this Silicon Valley blogger called Thomas Pueyo, who's not an epidemiologist at all, not really taken seriously by the scientific experts on SAGE, had this viral blog post, as you can see, it got 246,000 likes, called Coronavirus, Why You Must Act Now. And it presents a detailed case for, in a situation of exponential growth, the need to suppress transmission, the fact that if you act immediately, the overall costs are much lower because you can get the transmission down to very low levels much more quickly. The arguments are absolutely solid arguments, but the voice was very marginal, and so they were initially overlooked. I mean, SAGE was confident for a time that the sort of aggressive suppression being recommended by Pueyo and others was a bad idea. The root cause, as I go into detail in my paper on this, I think it wasn't a sort of insufficiently precautionary attitude or anything like that, but rather over-reliance on a specific set of reasonable worst-case scenario planning assumptions. And I think this is increasingly an accepted point. I went to a talk by Neil Ferguson last week where he really seemed to accept this point. There was this specific set of reasonable worst-case planning assumptions they were using where it was in the nature, this is a graph on the slide from the documents they produced in the early days of the pandemic. It's a sketch of a graph, but it shows the basic logic of why you shouldn't suppress too aggressively, because they thought the inevitable result of suppressing transmission too aggressively would be a much worse wave in the autumn at a time where the healthcare system was in an even worse position to cope with it. And so they thought the optimal strategy in the circumstances would be to try and land the peak on summer so that natural herd immunity was achieved during the summer when healthcare demand was lowest. And until around the week of 16th of March 2020, that was the logic. In the scenarios they were modeling, I mean, it made perfect sense, but there was a certain narrowness about planning assumptions and about policy options. And in the end, Sage does this dramatic about turn in the week of 16th of March, partly as a result of modeling from Neil Ferguson and his team, showing, among other things, just how large the size of that summer peak would be in relation to healthcare capacity, suggesting that the number of cases would exceed critical care capacity by a factor of about 8, and that the country was heading for an enormous disaster if that strategy was followed. So there's sort of two broad problems this early response seems to leave us with. One is the problem of groupthink, much discussed, I think, that on Sage, there was enough agreement, factual and evaluative, I would say. There was value judgments being made here about the relative harms. And there was enough agreement to make it possible for them to present a single recommended strategy to the government that was being described in government circles as the Sage recommended strategy. But that initial recommended strategy was badly mistaken. There's also a problem we might call the problem of accountability gaps that I think this case presents, where we had a situation, ministers would talk all the time about following the science at that stage of the pandemic. In practice, what following the science meant there was outsourcing big strategic calls to scientific advisors to a substantial degree. From a formal point of view, they don't decide policy. There's always the advisors advise, ministers decide slogan that goes back to Thatcher. But the role became this one of endorsing or rejecting recommendations coming out of Sage. And so to a substantial degree, the big strategic calls have been outsourced. And it creates a situation where it's very unclear how to secure democratic accountability, really, for the decisions that get made. You can hold the ministers to account at select committees, as the Science and Technology Committee and the Health and Social Care Committee has tried to do. But all they're going to say is, I was just following the science. I was just following advice. I can't be held accountable for the underlying mistakes in that advice. And so they slip through the net of accountability in a certain sense. And nor can you really hold the advisors to account. They have all been asked to make very detailed submissions to the ongoing public inquiry. But it would be unfair to sort of really load terrible consequences onto those advisors for just doing the job they were asked to do in the circumstances to the best of their ability. So there's a sort of accountability gap here. This decision seems to be being made in a way that, from a democratic point of view, is far from ideal. But then I want to compare that with the situation a bit later in the year, September 2020. I wrote a bit about this in my paper, but I'd already written the first draft at the time of these events, so I wrote it as an epilogue. But very different stuff happened in September of 2020. There was this emerging second wave at that time. Sage was calling quite strongly for aggressive suppression of this emerging second wave, and the minutes suggest some of the sort of normatively strongest messaging from Sage of any time in the pandemic, because they drew up a short list of interventions and they recommended implementation of a package of measures from that short list. The short list famously included a so-called circuit breaker lockdown of 2 weeks to try and reduce transmission. Their argument was, currently hospitals are some way from being overwhelmed, but one needs to act now to try and reduce transmission, because otherwise this problem is just going to build up. Johnson, though, was under significant pressure from anti-lockdown commentators at this time. I think it's also fair to say his own values were pretty lockdown skeptical, one might say, as probably everybody's was before the pandemic. Um, and so in order to get a broader view, held a now notorious Zoom call with dissenting experts. So he had Sunetra Gupta and Carl Hennigan from Oxford University, who were two of the major players on the so-called Great Barrington Declaration, and also Anders Tegnell from local hero for Joe, the key architect of the Swedish response to the pandemic, which was much discussed in Britain because it was said to have involved no lockdowns, although in practice measures were taken, and the amount of interaction in public places reduced enormously as a result of those measures. So it was far from as draconian as the UK's response, but nor was it a laissez-faire, do-nothing strategy. And John Edmonds from Sage was also in this meeting, figure very heavily involved in the UK's response at every stage, actually. I remember him on a TV program arguing with Thomas Pueyo in the early stages. And then in this stage, in the autumn, he was arguing with Gupta, Hennigan, Tegnell. The Great Barrington Declaration, as is well known, I think, emphasizes the large costs of lockdowns, and I think is absolutely correct to do that. We're still living now with the costs of these lockdowns. The educational harms to children are probably very significant and ongoing. I'd agree with that bit, but then it goes on to advocate a response to this problem that involves achieving herd immunity with or without vaccines. At the time it was written, there were no vaccines available. And so in effect, implicit in this statement is advocacy for a version of the strategy that in early 2020 had been clearly seen to have put us on course for total disaster. So, I mean, I didn't sign this declaration. Now, as a result of this meeting, we don't know what happened in the meeting. It wasn't an official meeting. There were no minutes. But this meeting happened. And then there was real and quite visible tension between the government's advisors and ministers in September, in that shortlist Sage had agreed on and recommended was not implemented. There was no circuit breaker lockdown, and nor was there any package of measures from that list implemented. And it was largely set aside until late October, so a period of just over a month, in which the actions Sage had called for were not implemented. And that, of course, had costs that are hard to estimate. I think if you look under the area under the excess death curve at that time, something in the region of around 15,000 deaths occurred during that period that might have conceivably been prevented had aggressive suppression been brought in just over a month earlier. It's important at the same time to say we can't pin the whole all the events of 2020 to winter 2020 to 21 on these errors. A huge number of the deaths were a direct result of the emergence of the Alpha variant. That variant emerged around September of 2020. It's very unlikely that at the time these decisions were being made, anything could have been done to stop the emergence of the Alpha variant. So it's a complicated mix of things that were under ministers' control and out of their control. I think the emergence of the Alpha variant was out of their control, but there were measures they could have taken here that would have made a material difference to the death counts in October and November. So it's illustrating a different set of problems to the initial response, in that it seems totally understandable to me that Johnson wanted to hear a broader range of perspectives that were fully representing the range of expert disagreement. I think he was correct to suspect, along with a lot of right-wing commentators, that Sage did not include that full range, that there were this dissenting group, including people like Gupta and Hennigan, who were quite deliberately excluded, I think, from the official committees because they were perceived to not have a credible position. But, I mean, there's different kinds of problems. There's the problem of what we might call an expertise gap. That if you put the advisors in charge, there's this accountability gap of a certain kind. But when you have politicians trying to adjudicate complex scientific matters, like the disagreements between Gupta and the mainstream epidemiologists, there's an obvious lack of expertise to choose between more or less credible arguments. And moreover, a problem of cherry picking that I think very plausibly went on here. And there's just such a clear incentive. If you're a politician and you're in the position of trying to adjudicate a scientific dispute and you lack the expertise to do so, you have a strong incentive to cherry pick those scientific opinions that are favorable to your political values and priorities. So, sort of four problems, and there's a certain kind of mirror image structure to these two cases. That the early response was characterized by insufficient openness to dissenting opinion. The response in September was characterized by a certain kind of chaotic openness, where dissenting opinions were heard, but they were heard directly by the Prime Minister, rather than there being any sort of process. And there was an opportunity there for Johnson and other ministers to feel as though they were in the position of adjudicating this dispute. So that motivates the challenge I started with, that when there's a scientific disagreement with major policy implications, quite generally, politicians will usually lack the expertise to adjudicate. They're incentivized to cherry pick. But outsourcing dispute resolution to the advisors creates a risk of groupthink and a lack of accountability. Can we do anything to solve this problem? And now moving on to the part of the talk that is about my thoughts about what might help. I've been thinking lately about a possible lesson from political philosophy. One lesson from the deliberative democracy literature is that, well, you put groups of people together and get them to deliberate about things, they don't always reach consensus. But it is sometimes easier to achieve a certain kind of meta-consensus, where we could think of meta-consensus broadly as being agreement regarding the range of reasonable positions to hold. Other people can see other people's views as reasonable, even when they continue to disagree. And ideally, we can hope for some agreement about how those positions relate to each other along relevant dimensions. At least in theory, meta-consensus is something that makes decision-making easier. We don't get consensus, but at least we know something of the dimensions along which to triangulate compromise and where to focus our attention in developing new potential options. So a nice example of this is from Christian List and Kai Spiekermann, who applied this concept of meta-consensus to Brexit at the time in 2019 when the UK Parliament was totally deadlocked and just could not agree about what to do with Brexit. And Spiekermann and List did this lovely analysis in which they looked at all the groups of MPs voting for different options and showed that implicit in the voting behavior was a certain kind of unidimensional ordering from, I think of it as like a scale from soft to hard, from softer to harder Brexits, where, as you move along that scale, you start to pick up allies from the middle. And then as you move along, you drop allies from the softer end, pick up allies from the harder end. And you can then see how the options are ordered, and you can see where the middle ground position is. And so without any intuitions about this, just purely based on the voting behavior. And their analysis suggested that there was this middle ground position in the middle of the voting behavior based on something like staying in the customs union or common market. No, in fact, there was no compromise was reached in Parliament in 2019. There was instead a general election that resulted in a new mandate for one of the absolute hardest options involving leaving the customs union. But in any case, I mean, I think List and Spiekermann are absolutely right to say that kind of meta-consensus could in principle have been very helpful for negotiating a compromise. Now, I think that idea has not really been carried over to the philosophy of science so far, but I think it's likely to be quite a useful one. That sometimes when there's very significant scientific disagreement, it's possible to identify certain kinds of scientific meta-consensus. And I do think in that time of great disagreement, September 2020, scientists right across the range of reasonable opinion were in a position to agree on important points where, you know, to disagree with those points would really have put you outside the reasonable window. I mean, there was agreement on what the main policy options were and how they ranked from more restrictive to less restrictive. There was also agreement about how the options ranked in relation to specific types of harm, educational harms, mental health harms, likelihood of healthcare system collapse, short-term excess deaths. I think everyone was in a position to agree, for example, that the circuit breaker lockdown idea was a way to minimize the likelihood of healthcare system collapse. It was a way of doing so that would have, if it involved schools, had educational harms. If it did not involve schools, would have greatly mitigated those harms, that it would have caused mental health harms, but that but through minimizing likelihood of healthcare system collapse would have reduced short-term excess deaths. An agreement too about facts about optimal timing, especially this crucial point that aggressive suppression can be relaxed sooner if it's implemented sooner. An agreement too about the dangers of a hybrid strategy of the type actually implemented that goes for aggressive suppression at the latest possible moment. I think, you know, everyone right through to from Edmonds to Gupta and Hennigan would have been in a position to agree on those points. Of course, there were huge disagreements as well. These disagreements centered on the absolute magnitudes of the harms. For example, a persistent belief from Gupta, Hennigan et al. That projections of excess deaths were exaggerated. On the likelihood of an imminent vaccine, where part of the idea for the Great Barrington people was that we can't count on having a vaccine imminently, and so simply suppressing transmission until that point was not viable. In fact, I mean, by September, it's looking pretty promising that there would be one, and there was. Disagreement about the viability of a strategy based on shielding the vulnerable, because that's another part of the Great Barrington Declaration, the idea that the way to mitigate excess death is through cocooning or shielding vulnerable people. And disagreement on the relative importance of different kinds of harm and risk. Now that last one is just evaluative and you're not going to get away from it. The fact that if you close schools, you harm children enormously, and that relative importance has to be weighed against the benefits of protecting the lives of primarily elderly and other vulnerable people. Those evaluative calls people just will disagree about, and that just isn't going to go away. Some of these other things, I mean, they have a strong factual element and facts can be brought to bear on them. As I say, I think there were good reasons to think a vaccine was in the pipeline by that point. I think there were reasons from the experience of the spring to doubt the viability of a strategy based on shielding the vulnerable. So the disagreement is a mix of evaluative disagreements that will persist no matter what, and factual ones where information that's available from other sources can actually shift probabilities. I think, think about this design challenge and how this idea of meta-consensus might help. I mean, the design challenge points to the need for openness to evidence from marginal sources in real time, so that we're not there saying, you know, that blogger got it right weeks ago, shame we didn't listen to him. But at the same time, mechanisms to obstruct the direct lobbying of politicians, because the advice is a complicated mix of evaluative and factual opinion. And we don't want a situation where people with very strong opinions on the relevant value judgments are just lobbying politicians for specific outcomes, which is a bit like what happened here. The the solution I can think of to this is, I suppose, quite an expensive one. I think what we need is something like a well-resourced secretariat of scientifically literate civil servants with what we might call meta-expertise, where by meta-expertise I mean the ability to vet submitted evidence for scientific credibility, the ability to analyze patterns of agreement and disagreement. I think it's hard to have that kind of meta expertise, but it's not spooky or mysterious either. It's something that a lot of people in the scientific world have. If you think of the editors of Science or Nature, these generalist scientific journals, it's a very comparable skill set. What they're doing on a daily basis is evaluating lots of submissions from different fields for their credibility and importance. Their job doesn't center so much on looking for patterns of agreement and disagreement, but no doubt they could do that if that was the job. Problem we had, I think, is that there weren't the resources to provide that kind of function. The Civil Contingency Secretariat has, I think, about 75 employees with a huge amount to do, and evidently lack the resources to dedicate major resources to vetting submissions of evidence. But the sort of costs we're talking about here are tiny in relation to, the billions spent on something like the test and trace program, and the benefits would have been enormous. So to put it all in graphical form, the thought is something like this, that we don't necessarily want SAGE to become this massive thing with hundreds of different people, including loads of dissenting voices, because then it descends into chaos. It's good for it to be small and focused and to try to achieve consensus. But then we need a parallel stream that is an open call for evidence, including from scientifically marginal figures, analyzed by a well-resourced secretariat with meta-expertise, looking for points of meta-consensus right across the reasonable disagreement zone. We then want all of that being reported to decision makers so that they're in a position to see what their advisors are advising, but also where the dissent from that lies and what the reasonable range of dissent is and how credible it is. I think that's the sort of mechanism that we would have benefited from at both stages of 2020, and that might have led to better decisions than the decisions we actually got. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks very much for your attention.